Let's begin our moment here in 2 Corinthians with the Lord's Prayer. You could say it together with me, if you like. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Well, we have chosen, or I have chosen, 2 Corinthians for our study. And as you are well aware, those of you who have been with me over the years, we go slow. We don't rush through, and we don't do 13 chapters in 13 weeks, right? I imagine this will take us to the end of the spring or close to it as we walk through this book. But here's the reason I chose this book. It's kind of the stepchild of 1 Corinthians, right? 1 Corinthians usually gets the emphasis because there's a lot of controversial text in 1 Corinthians and a lot of argument and debate and wondering what in the world that means and how it applies. I mean, that 1 Corinthians gets a lot of attention. It's first, firstborn usually gets more attention than the middle child, and or even the last child, which 2 Corinthians is the last one out of 4, really, which we'll talk more about here in a moment. But the reason I chose 2 Corinthians is I think it is a perfect fit for the kind of context in which we're living. We are living in a time of struggle. Whether we're talking about COVID and all the complications that arise out of that pandemic, or whether we're talking about kind of cultural issues that are creating hostility between people groups, or manifesting hostility that already existed between people groups. There's also a lack of, or there is what's a good word here? A loss of respect for Christianity in our culture. There's also a lot of fatigue in terms of not only dealing with all these things, but just people tired of doing Christian ministry. I don't know how many ministers I have known over the past 18 months, especially in the last 6 months, that have decided to move out of ministry instead of continuing in it. Now, I certainly don't want to judge any of that. There may very well be very good reasons for moving out. And a lot of my friends, some of my friends who have moved out, I honor their choice. And they haven't stopped ministering, right? They've shifted gears, you might say, and are ministering in different ways. And I honor that and respect that. But part of the general feel here is I'm just tired. I mean, working through digitization, doing church over Zoom and Facebook Live, that was hard, and it's still hard. And dealing with all the kinds of squabbles that are taking place in the community because of those situations, and because of the lack of community and the lack of interaction, it has just sucked the life out of a lot of people, whether paid staff or shepherds or members or ministry leaders of different sorts. I mean, it really has. And I've felt it, and I know a lot of my friends have felt it. And so I think 2 Corinthians is almost tailor-made, you might say. Of course, it isn't. but it fits so well to address the church in this kind of situation. Because Paul is dealing with any number of things that are kind of correlate to what we just described. Paul is struggling with hostility from some people in the Corinthian church. Paul is struggling with a kind of inner turmoil within the Corinthian church. And they are assaulting him. They are speaking negatively about him. You know, it's one of those famous phrases in 2 Corinthians. Oh, well, when he's writing a letter, he sounds really bold, but when he's in person, he's a pushover. You know, so dealing with that aspect. There's also this struggle over strength and weakness. About what do you boast? What do you boast? So we got some people coming into Corinth and they're boasting about all their revelations and visions and all the good stuff that they've been blessed with. And Paul says, I don't want to boast about that. I'm going to boast in my weakness. I'm going to boast in my suffering. And a lot of the text in 2 Corinthians articulates some of the suffering that Paul endured. That there's not only the suffering of, shipwrecked 3 times, stoned once, whipped 5 times. There's that kind of suffering, but there's also the suffering that's happening between Paul and Corinth. He loves these people. He planted that church. He lived there for 18 months when he planted it. And now, as he's going back and forth with them through visits and letters and reports, his heart is really wounded. He has a wounded heart with regard to the Corinthians. These are people that, he's led unto Christ and has nurtured them and matured them. And now now they don't like him. What do you do with that? The people you've poured yourself into, and the response you get back from them a year later is, we're not so sure about you anymore. And one of the things they complain about is, well, you wouldn't take any pay. I see somebody else who's trying to get in here, which this will look good on video. There we go. So one of the things that they're upset with him about is because these new people came in and they got paid for their ministry to Corinth. They apparently demanded pay because I got something good. If I got something good, you're going to pay for it, right? That's what makes it good. If you get, if it's free, it can't be worth much, right? Well, Paul went in there with free. He didn't ask to be paid. He didn't do it for money. And now Corinth is saying, hey, you gave it to us free. It must not be worth much. But these people, they want to be paid. They must have something worth something. Now, how would that make you feel? I mean, Paul is wounded in this letter, but he's also hopeful. Hopeful because something has shifted, and we'll see it as we go through the letter. But that's why I think this letter fits so well, because all of it's about Paul telling the Corinthians in terms of exhorting them and about his own self. I'm not going to give up. Yeah, life has its negative dimensions. Life is awful at the moment. I can tell you about all my suffering, but I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give up. And that's what this letter is about. About chapter 4, verse 1, for example. We're not going to faint. We're just not going to lose steam here. Or chapter 4, verse 16. Let us not faint. All right. And I feel like that's a word of the Lord for the contemporary church. Because we got all that woundedness going on. We got all that desolation going on. We have all those intramural church struggles going on. Wear a mask or not wear a mask. You know, we got all that fighting going on. And people are wounded by it, hurt by it. We get that sense of, I thought I knew these people. And they're acting like that. You know, I mean, we get that feel. Paul had that feeling about the Corinthians. I thought I knew these people. But now look what they're doing. You know. So it's a word of faithfulness. Don't give up. Right? And Paul is going to tell us why he doesn't give up. What are the theological resources that he draws on that empower him in his ministry? What gives him consolation? He's going to recognize the desolation, right? But he's going to also identify the consolation. I'm using these in Ignatian spirituality. Those are very, very predominant words: consolation and desolation. What has desolated you today? What has brought you, taken life from you today? But what has given you life today? It's an exercise, a spiritual exercise. But Paul uses that language in 2 Corinthians. He talks about what gives him consolation, but also what has given him desolation. And we'll see that as we walk through. Now, the difficult thing about 2 Corinthians is that we are dropping into a conversation that has all been going on for about, well, at least 4 years. And the only evidence we have of this conversation, that what they were actually talking about, are what we call 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, right? I just think, if you had a family, you had a long-standing family squabble over the last 5 years, some kind of family squabble, and I come along 200 years later, and I read 2 letters from one of the persons involved in the family squabble, how much do you think I'm going to figure out about that? You know, I'm not going to figure out a whole lot about that, right? There are going to be a lot of things that I'm not going to know. Things that were said, things that were reported, especially when I also know the 2 letters. I have 2 of the letters you wrote, but there are 2 other letters that I don't have a copy of. And what was said in those letters? That's what we have with 2 Corinthians. We've been dropped into the middle of a conversation, a back and forth sort of conversation that has been tumultuous, even hostile at times, painful at times. And we have 2 letters to try to get into that world. So I think we just have to be upfront and admit, yes, this is a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know. We know that Paul planted the church. And you have the outline I gave you. We're going to walk through this chronology, which is also available on my website, johnmarkhicks.com. You can find this chronology on my website if you want to look there. But these 12 points are kind of the 12 movements of the relationship between Paul and Corinth, which happened over a period of years. Paul planted this church probably around 51 AD. Probably. Nobody can be absolutely sure, but probably around 51 AD. And ultimately wrote 2 Corinthians somewhere around late 56, early 57. So if you put those dates together, that's like 5, almost 6 years of relationship. So when we're reading 2 Corinthians, we're reading the back end of that, right? Back end of this 5-year relationship that Paul has had with Corinth. But he plants the church, as you know, on the second missionary journey. He comes across Turkey, goes to Troas, hears the Macedonian call. Remember, he has this vision of someone on the other side in Macedonia say, come over and help us. And so Paul goes to Thessalonica and Philippi, and then Berea. He's run out of town in Philippi, right? And so he goes alone. He's traveling with Timothy and Silas. He goes alone to Athens, and then he goes to Corinth. And then Timothy and Silas join up with him in Corinth around 51 AD. Plants the church. Stays about 18 months. This is where he's also with Aquila and Priscilla, right? They're with him there. He does his own, remember, he makes his own living, making tents or doing some kind of leather working. Doesn't take any money from the Corinthians for his teaching and for his ministry. He refuses to do that. He tells us why in 1 Corinthians, why he did that. He didn't want it to be a scandal for the gospel. He didn't want you to think, he didn't want the Corinthians to think, I'm just in this to make a buck. I'm just in this to accumulate wealth. He said, I'm not good. He says, that's what some of these philosophers do, these cynics and others. They walk around city and they have a patron who pays them. And I didn't want you to think I was like that. I just wanted you to hear the gospel. Right? So he stays for 18 months and then heads back to Jerusalem, not Jerusalem, but he goes back to Antioch. But he goes through Ephesus and apparently takes Aquila and Priscilla with him and drops them off in Ephesus, and he goes to Antioch. Doesn't stay there long. He leaves again, this time on the third missionary journey. He leaves to go across Turkey again and visiting some of the cities where he planted churches on his first missionary journey in Galatia, right, in Phrygia. Gets to Troas. Comes across to Ephesus, comes straight to Ephesus, where he stays for 3 years. And it's while he's at Ephesus that this interaction continues with Corinth. At some point, if you notice point 4 there, at some point, Paul writes a letter to Corinth. We don't have this letter. It's a letter he mentions in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. The reference is there on the handout. But he writes a letter, and apparently he had heard that sexual immorality of some sort was prevalent in Corinth. That the sexual ethic was a problem of some kind. And so he writes a letter, apparently pretty stern letter from what we can tell, but we don't know a whole lot about it. We just know he wrote a letter and it was this topic, and that's about it. About all we know. And apparently when they receive that letter, at some point, they respond. And they don't respond, they may have responded with a letter, we don't know. But we do know they responded by sending some representatives from the household of Chloe, for example, which was a woman. There was a woman in charge of a household there, apparently, and her household that may have been a house church in which she was a leader of a house church. But whatever the case may be, they send some people to Corinth and along with a letter. Presumably, because Paul has some very specific responses when he writes 1 Corinthians. This is the origin of 1 Corinthians. He writes a letter in response to this entourage that comes from Corinth, maybe even with a letter. And so 1 Corinthians is written to respond to them. And if you remember something about 1 Corinthians, remember the first part of the letter is about the divisions within Corinth. Corinth was a mess, right? I am of Cephas. No, I am of Apollos. You know, apparently Apollos came into Corinth after Paul left at some point, pretty soon, apparently, after he left. Apparently gained a following of some sort, or maybe these were people who came from Ephesus and knew Apollos. There's so many things we don't know. But it's a mess. We know that because they're divided. Right? And Paul spends the first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians addressing the division and the nature of that division, which was about jealousy and about who's more important and who is laying the foundation. So who should we follow? And Paul says, look, Jesus laid the foundation. I planted, Apollos watered, God gives the increase. This is about God. This is not about Apollos or Paul, right? But then he starts addressing specific questions. And he uses a kind of a phrase like now concerning. Now concerning. Now concerning the resurrection, for example, in chapter 15, or now concerning the collection in chapter 16, or now concerning chapter 7, sexual ethics in divorce, remarriage, and those sorts. So apparently he's going down the list. Okay, you asked about this. Here's what I think. You asked about this. Here's what I think. You asked about this. In other words, Paul's not writing 1 Corinthians by sitting back, reflecting, and saying, what are the 5 things I really want them to know? That's not what he's doing, right? Paul is in fact looking at a mess and saying, here are the 12 things you asked about and what you need to get straightened out, right? So we would call that kind of an occasional letter. It's a responsive letter, a letter that responds to the situation, that deals with the whatever's happening in that congregation or congregations, depending on how many house churches we're talking about in Corinth, which we don't know either. But that's 1 Corinthians, written sometime while Paul was in Ephesus, maybe 54, 55. We don't know, really. But Paul intended to visit Corinth after writing 1 Corinthians. He intended to kind of go up through Macedonia, kind of track the way he did it before, go up through Troas, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, come on down to Corinth. But something happened. And Paul changed his plans. Something happened. Apparently, when Paul sent the letter with Timothy, and Timothy brings back their response to 1 Corinthians. Some things apparently worked out, but there were some other things that did not go well. That apparently, and we'll see this reflected in 2 Corinthians, apparently there were some people who were really hostile to Paul and either disagreed with what he was saying or questioned his apostleship or wanted to assert their own power. What exactly happened is we don't really know. We'll get some hints and we'll look at those as we walk through 2 Corinthians. But Timothy brings that message back and says, look, Paul, hey, it's worse than we thought. And here's what happened while I was there. And Paul, instead of waiting to make that long trip up through northern Greece, makes an emergency visit to Corinth. This is something that's got to be dealt with now, apparently. Paul, he's not going to wait for a long journey. And I think, that tells you something about the passion Paul has for Corinth, that he didn't want to wait. He didn't want to let that fester, right? He wanted to address it immediately. And so he takes this trip across the sea, across the Aegean Sea there. from Ephesus, what we now call Turkey, to Greece, Corinth. And Paul refers to this as a painful visit. A painful visit. We don't know exactly what happened. He doesn't give us a lot of details. He does mention some particular person in chapter 2 of 2 Corinthians that apparently something had been healed in a relationship between Paul and a particular person. But Corinth was still very hostile to this person. And Paul says, look, you need to forgive him just as I have forgiven him. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So there may have been, in this painful visit, there may have been a real angry kind of altercation between Paul and a specific individual. And you can imagine, we've all had those sorts of things, right? One of those painful tit for tat kind of situations. And so when Paul comes back, he writes his third letter. That first letter, and then 1 Corinthians, which is the second letter. When he comes back to Corinth, he doesn't just let it lie, right? He comes back disturbed. He comes back a little taken aback, unsettled. And he fires off another letter when he gets back. And this letter, he calls it a severe letter. And we don't have a copy of that. Now, some scholars think 2 Corinthians 10 to 13 is that letter. And that's possible, because what happens in the ancient world is sometimes you put two things together, to preserve it in one scroll. So that's been argued. I'm not convinced myself, but it's possible. But even 2 Corinthians 10 to 13 isn't as severe as Paul seems to let on about this letter, right? But whatever the case may be, this was a painful visit, and then it was a painful letter. And now Paul's waiting for the Corinthian response. Put yourself there. What kind of feelings are you having? What kind of hopes? What kind of dread? Oh no, is it going to get worse? Somebody going to take sides, He sends that letter with Titus. And he hopes that Titus will get there and help fix things, fix. But Paul's uncertain how this is going to play out. I mean, he's not omniscient. He's just a human being who's been called by God into ministry. He doesn't know everything about the future. He doesn't know how all this is going to work. And you can imagine how his depth of feeling for the people there. The depth of feeling. So he calls it a tearful letter as well. So he sends it with Titus, and he waits for Titus. He says, Titus, I'll meet you in Troas. Because during certain seasons of the particularly in the winter, you don't take a boat across the Aegean. Right? It's just too hazardous. You have to take the overland route, right? And so Titus apparently we don't know that he took that route to take the letter, but Paul is expecting to take the overland route on the way back. And so Paul says, you go with the letter, and I'll meet you in Troas. I'm not going to sit around and wait. Apparently, he thought the letter would be better than him going in person again, because he just got back from a visit. but he hoped that the letter might have an effect. And so Paul goes to Troas, and he's waiting for Titus. And Titus doesn't come. He doesn't come. Paul's anxious. I got to figure this out. I got to know what happened. So he goes to Macedonia. And that's where he and Titus meet up, in Macedonia. This is where you get, in chapter 7 of 2 Corinthians, you get this elation, that the news from Titus was wonderful. The news from Titus was that the church has renewed its love with Paul and has dealt with things appropriately, and the things are healthier, at least. Let's put it that way. Exactly what that means, that's hard to say, but Titus has a good report. But what we learn from 2 Corinthians, though he has a good report, we know there are still at least 2 problems. At least. We could even maybe say 3. At least 3 problems. Yeah, we'll go ahead and say 3. One problem is Corinth has not been living up to its commitment to get a collection for the poor saints in Jerusalem. Now you can imagine all this fuss between Paul and Corinth and the unsettled nature of Corinthian church. You might imagine, I don't think we're going to give Paul that money. You can imagine how that kind of conversation might be taking place, right? I don't think I can trust this Paul guy. We're having a fight with him. We're not going to give him money. So you can imagine something like that going on. Maybe something more than that, but at least something like that. And so Paul has to spend 2 chapters trying to persuade the Corinthians to make a collection of money for the church in Jerusalem. And a lot of us, we were together, I guess 2 years ago, we went through 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Would that take us like 9 weeks, 10 weeks? Something like that. We'll go through it faster this time, but maybe not. We'll see. But that's one problem. A second problem is that apparently there were some unrepentant people who were not just continuing in the backbiting and the strife, but they were continuing in the immorality and the kind of rebellious disobedience. And Paul said, I'll have to deal with that when I get there. Right? But apparently there's still a group, maybe a minor group, that still has that, still projecting that kind of problem. But then there's a third problem. And this is the one that's really annoying because we don't know a lot about it. We only get the first inkling of it, it seems to me at least, as I read 2 Corinthians, that we don't hear about this in previous letter in 1 Corinthians, that this is a new problem that has popped up in 2 Corinthians. And this is the problem that some outsiders have come to Corinth. Paul calls them super apostles. He's being sarcastic, of course. If you like sarcasm, you're going to love 2 Corinthians. There's a lot of sarcasm in 2 Corinthians. I'm not a big fan of sarcasm myself, so I have to really try to give Paul his due here, but he has a lot of sarcasm. He calls them super apostles, but I don't think he's being complimentary. But these super apostles, we don't know who they are. We don't know where they came from. We got some hints, but nothing really. It's kind of like we're dropping into the middle of a conversation, right? It's as if you walked into a room and somebody's been having a conversation on the phone with somebody else for an hour, and you walk in and you hear just 2 minutes and walk out. How much do you really know? You don't know a whole lot, right? In fact, you might have a lot of questions after hearing 2 minutes. And say, well, what were you talking about? What was that about? Well, why did you use that word? Why did you call them that? All kinds of questions you'd have for people, for the one you're listening to. So we're like one end of the conversation. We're only listening to one end of the conversation, and we only got a little bit of the one end. Right? And that's kind of where we are with 2 Corinthians. We just got a little bit of the conversation of something that's been a 5-year conversation. And now there's something has happened between the painful letter and the painful visit. Something has happened, it seems, at least it seems to me. Something has happened that other people have come in from the outside, getting paid for what they do. That is, they have come into Corinth and they are ministering to the church, and they're getting paid for what they do, and they are boasting about their qualifications and how sufficient they are and what kind of visions they've had. And they're really putting Paul down. He's not a real apostle. He doesn't even get paid for what he does. He's not a real apostle. He's always suffering. He's always in trouble. Even when Paul writes 2 Corinthians, he describes an event that happened in Asia while he's in Ephesus, presumably, that almost killed him, almost took his life. And these super apostles are saying, nothing like that's happened to us. God is on our side, right? God's protecting us. Who are you going to believe? You're going to believe someone whom God has blessed and given a good life and given them these great abilities to speak, great rhetoricians, popular, celebrity status. You're going to believe them, or are you going to believe the guy who's been in 3 shipwrecks? Already. He's got another one to come, at least one, right? I mean, can you hear that? I don't think that's too far away from what some people do with kind of celebrity pastors and the way we exalt celebrity pastors over the ones who are struggling day to day, whether in persecution or whether in tribulation or whether in plagues or whether in sickness and disease. We say, oh, God's with them. Yeah, this brother's struggling. This sister is having a hard time. But man, God is with him. Can you hear that might happen in Corinth? These new people coming in, and they give a different picture. Oh, they can speak so well. But Paul, he's hard to listen to. He doesn't speak so well. He sounds good in letters, but when he's in person, he's not impressive. But these super apostles are. And so Paul spends 3 chapters, 10, 11, and 12, dealing with the super apostles, because this is a new problem that has arisen. So when Titus comes back to meet Paul in Macedonia, he brings good news, but also this other news about the 3 problems: the collection, the unrepentant group, the impenitent group, and the super apostles. Paul's still got his work cut out for him. And we'll see how he handles that in chapters 12 and 13. But eventually, he sends Titus ahead of him. Now, Titus, you go ahead of me. And he writes 2 Corinthians. And he sends 2 Corinthians with Titus to prepare the ground for his 3rd visit, which now he undertakes after spending some time in Macedonia. Yeah.
So it's 1 Corinthians, the 2nd letter, and 2 Corinthians, the 4th letter?
Yes. 1 Corinthians is the 2nd letter, and 2 Corinthians is the 4th letter. Or maybe we can say A, B, C, and D. 1 Corinthians is letter B. And 2 Corinthians is letter D. And boy, would we love to have those other two letters just to see what was going on. What that tells us is, the Bible didn't drop out of the sky, right? The Bible is given to us through human processes. And God is superintending those processes, for sure. But we don't have everything that was ever written. What we have is what was, you might say, what the church used and retained for its own discipline and its own teaching. What the church preserved for its own guidance. And I think we have to see God involved in that preserving activity. So we have a collection of documents that are the means by which God will guide the church. But that doesn't mean we have all the documents that were written. Now, there have been some forgeries. The Middle Ages did create some forgeries of at least one of these letters. We always want to fill in the gaps. That's human beings. We want to fill in the gaps so that everything fits. Well, our time is up. So I am grateful for your presence. It's really good to see everybody. Just does my heart well. Warms my heart. Just remember, I'm gonna have to call out any super apostles I recognize, and deal with y'all. Okay, yeah. Paul says, you better get this fixed before I get there, because if you think my letter is tough, I'm going to be even tougher when I get there. It's as he tells them in chapter 13. But let's close with a prayer. Lord God, we give you thanks. May your word sink into our hearts. May we find in 2 Corinthians a resource and a wealth of your treasures to guide us in these turbulent times. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.